The living room felt impossibly quiet, except for the gentle hum of the dishwasher finishing its cycle in the kitchen. Sarah Martinez sat cross-legged on the parpet, her 7-year-old daughter Emma's art supplies scattered around them like colorful confetti. The assignment was simple enough: create a family tree for 2nd grade. What should have been a pleasant Sunday afternoon activity had transformed into something far more complicated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mommy, why don't we have pictures of your daddy? Emma asked, her small fingers gripping a red crayon as she worked on drawing stick figures. Her 9-year-old brother Jake looked up from his tablet, suddenly interested in the conversation he'd been ignoring for the past 20 minutes. Sarah's hand paused over the construction paper, her smile faltering for just a moment. Well, sweetheart, sometimes families are complicated. Grandpa Joe lives very far away, and we don't see him very often. The explanation felt hollow even to her own ears, the same rehearsed response she'd been giving for years whenever the children asked about her father. But Tommy's grandpa lives in Florida, and they still have pictures everywhere, Jake chimed in, his voice carrying that particular brand of logic that only children possessed. And they video call him every week. Why can't we call Grandpa Joe? The weight of 2 decades worth of carefully constructed lies pressed down on Sarah's shoulders. She had built her entire adult life around the principle of protecting her children from the truth about Joseph Martinez, the man who had disappeared from their family narrative before they were even born. Her husband David knew fragments of the story, enough to understand why certain topics were off limits, but even he didn't know the complete picture. Some grown-up stuff happened a long time ago, Sarah said carefully, reaching for Emma's glue stick to buy herself a few seconds to think. Your grandfather made some choices that hurt our family, and sometimes when people make big mistakes, it changes everything. Emma's face scrunched up in the way it always did when she was processing information that didn't quite make sense to her 7-year-old worldview. Like when Jake broke Mom's vase and had to give up his allowance for a month? Something like that, but much bigger, Sarah replied, though the comparison made her stomach twist. If only it had been as simple as a broken vase and lost allowance money. The sound of David's key turning in the front door provided a welcome interruption. He appeared in the doorway carrying grocery bags, his dark hair still damp from the light rain that had started falling outside. "How's the family tree project going?" he asked, setting the bags down and kissing Sarah on the forehead. "We're trying to figure out where to put Grandpa Joe," Jake announced with the casual directness that made Sarah's heart skip beats during conversations like these. David's eyes met Sarah's over the children's heads, a flash of understanding passing between them. They had discussed this possibility countless times over the years, knowing that eventually their children would ask questions that couldn't be deflected with vague answers about geographical distance and grown-up complications. "Why don't you two go wash up for lunch? Mom and I will finish cleaning up the art supplies." As the children thundered up the stairs, their voices echoing through the house as they debated whether they wanted grilled cheese or turkey sandwiches, Sarah began gathering scattered crayons with mechanical precision. "They're getting older. The questions are getting harder to answer." David knelt beside her, his presence steady and reassuring in the way it had been for the 12 years of their marriage. "Maybe it's time to tell them something closer to the truth. Age-appropriate, but honest." The word honest hung in the air between them like challenge. Sarah had built her entire identity around being truthful with her children, teaching them the value of integrity and openness. Yet she had constructed their understanding of family history on a foundation of carefully maintained omissions. The irony wasn't lost on her. "I don't know how to explain that their grandfather is someone I've spent 20 years trying to forget," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do you tell children that the reason they don't have pictures of Grandpa Joe is because seeing his face makes their mother feel sick?" Before David could respond, Emma's voice drifted down from upstairs. "Dad, the TV in your room is being weird again." David sighed,
the moment of serious conversation interrupted by the practical demands of parenting. I'll go check on it. But Sarah, we should talk about this more tonight. The kids deserve to know something, even if it's not everything. As David headed upstairs to deal with the television situation, Sarah remained on the living room floor, surrounded by the remnants of what should have been a simple school project. She picked up Emma's half-finished family tree, studying the carefully drawn stick figures that represented their small, nuclear family. There was David, with his characteristic beard rendered in brown crayon, herself, with yellow hair that somehow managed to look cheerful despite being drawn in stick figure form, and the two children with enormous smiles that took up most of their circular heads. The space where extended family should have been was noticeably empty. David's parents appeared on his side of the tree, drawn with the loving detail that came from regular visits and accumulated memories. Her mother occupied a lonely branch on Sarah's side, labeled Grandma Rosa in Emma's careful 7-year-old handwriting, but the space where a paternal grandfather should have been remained blank, a conspicuous absence that had apparently become impossible for the children to ignore. Sarah's phone buzzed on the coffee table, interrupting her contemplation of family trees and absent fathers. A text from her best friend Marina. "Are you watching Channel 7? Call me." The message sent an inexplicable chill down Sarah's spine. Marina wasn't prone to dramatic texts, and something about the urgency implied in those 8 words made Sarah reach for the television remote with trembling fingers. She navigated to Channel 7, the local news station that usually served as background noise during breakfast preparation and homework supervision. The afternoon news program was in progress, the anchor's professional voice filling the living room as Sarah increased the volume. Federal authorities have reopened the investigation into the Riverside construction scandal that rocked the city 2 decades ago. Several suspects who were originally given plea deals are now facing additional charges as new evidence has come to light. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Riverside Construction, the name that had haunted her nightmares for 20 years, the reason she had changed her last name from Martinez to her mother's maiden name Delgado during college, before changing it again to David's surname when they married, the company that had stolen millions of dollars in government contracts while cutting corners on safety regulations, leading to the collapse of a school building that injured dozens of children. The screen filled with a photograph she recognized despite the passage of 20 decades. Joseph Martinez, her father, looking younger but wearing the same defiant expression she remembered from the last time she had seen him. The caption beneath his picture read, "Joseph Martinez, former Riverside construction foreman, arrested this morning on additional fraud and conspiracy charges." The world seemed to tilt sideways, just as it had 20 years ago when she first learned the truth about her father's involvement in the scandal. But this time, the revelation came with an additional layer of complexity. Her children were in the house. Emma's family tree project still spread across the living room floor, physical evidence of questions she had been avoiding for their entire lives. "Sarah?" David's voice came from the stairway, concerned and questioning. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." She couldn't respond immediately, her attention fixed on the television screen as the news report continued. The anchor was detailing the reopened investigation, mentioning new witness testimony and previously hidden documents that had come to light during a separate federal probe into municipal corruption. Sarah's father was one of 6 men who'd been arrested that morning, their mugshots displayed in a neat row across the screen like a lineup of her worst memories. "Mom?" Jake appeared at the bottom of the stairs, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to genuine concern as he took in his mother's pale face and rigid posture. "What's wrong?" Emma bounded down the stairs behind her brother, her energy filling the room in the way that only 7-year-olds manage. She took one look at the television screen, where her grandfather's photograph was still displayed alongside the other suspects, and her face lit up with recognition that made Sarah's heart stop. "That man looks like you, Mommy," Emma announced with the innocent observation that children made without understanding their impact. "He has the same nose and the same dark eyes. Is that your daddy?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Sarah felt David's hand on her shoulder, steady and supportive, but even his presence couldn't anchor her to the moment. 20 years of careful construction, of deliberately built distance between her past and her present, crumbled in the space of a 7-year-old's casual observation. Jake, older and more perceptive, looked between the television screen and his mother's face with growing understanding. "Mom, is that really Grandpa Joe? Is that why we don't talk about him?" Sarah reached for the remote with shaking hands, turning off the television as if she could somehow undo what her children had just witnessed. But the damage was done. Emma was already asking follow-up questions, her curiosity piqued by the mystery that had just been revealed, while Jake stood quietly, processing this new information with the careful consideration that had always made him seem older than his 9 years. "Kids, why don't you go upstairs and play for a little while?" David suggested, his voice gentle but firm. "Mom and I need to talk about some grown-up things." "But I want to know about Grandpa Joe," Emma protested, her lower lip jutting out in the stubborn expression that appeared whenever she felt she was being excluded from important conversations. "If that's really him on TV, why can't we talk about him? What did he do that was so bad?" The directness of the question cut through Sarah's shock, forcing her to confront the reality she had been dreading for nearly a decade. Her children were no longer babies who could be distracted with snacks and cartoon programs. They were intelligent, perceptive individuals who deserved explanations for the gaps in their family history, even if those explanations would shatter the carefully maintained innocence she had worked so hard to preserve. "Emma, Jake, come sit down," Sarah said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. She moved to the couch, gesturing for her children to join her, while David settled into the chair across from them, ready to provide support, but allowing her to control the conversation. "That man on TV is your grandfather," Sarah began, the words feeling strange and foreign after years of avoidance. "His name is Joseph Martinez, and he's my father. But he did something very bad a long time ago, before either of you were born, and that's why we don't talk about him." Emma scooted closer on the couch, her small hand finding Sarah's arm. "What kind of bad thing?" Sarah looked at David, silently asking for guidance on how much truth was appropriate for a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old to handle. He nodded encouragingly, trusting her judgment while making it clear that he would step in if she needed him to.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He worked for a company that was supposed to build safe buildings, like schools and hospitals, Sarah explained carefully. But instead of using good materials and following the rules, they used cheap materials and kept the extra money for themselves. When one of the buildings fell down, children got hurt. Jake's eyes widened as he processed this information. Kids got hurt because Grandpa Joe didn't build things the right way? That's right. And when the police found out what his company was doing, Grandpa Joe had to go to jail. That happened when I was in college, about 20 years ago. Emma's brow furrowed as she tried to understand the timeline. But why didn't you tell us before? Why is it a secret? The question struck at the heart of Sarah's guilt and shame. How could she explain to her children that she had been so devastated by her father's betrayal that she had essentially erased him from existence? That the man who had taught her to ride a bicycle and helped her with math homework had turned out to be someone capable of putting children's lives at risk for money? Sometimes when people we love do terrible things, it hurts so much that we don't want to think about them anymore, Sarah said slowly. I was so angry and sad about what your grandfather did that I decided it was easier to pretend he didn't exist. But that wasn't fair to you, and I'm sorry I didn't tell you the truth before. David leaned forward in his chair. What your mom is trying to say is that adults sometimes make mistakes too, even big ones like not talking about difficult things when they should. Jake was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking through everything he had just learned. Finally, he looked up at Sarah with an expression that was far too mature for his 9 years. Are we going to be in trouble because of what Grandpa Joe did? The question revealed a level of worry that Sarah hadn't anticipated.
She immediately pulled both children closer, wrapping them in a hug that was as much for her own comfort as theirs. "No, sweetheart. What your grandfather did has nothing to do with you or our family now. We're safe, and we're going to be okay." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah wasn't entirely sure they were true. The news report had mentioned additional charges and new evidence. If her father was facing a fresh trial, there might be media attention, background investigations, and renewed interest in the families of everyone involved in the original scandal. The carefully constructed life she had built could be about to come under scrutiny in ways she had never anticipated. Emma pulled back from the hug, her face serious in the way that always preceded her most challenging questions. "Do you think Grandpa Joe is sorry for what he did?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. In all the years she had spent avoiding thoughts of her father, she had never seriously considered the possibility that he might feel remorse for his actions. The man who had gone to trial 20 years ago had maintained his innocence even when presented with overwhelming evidence of his guilt. He had blamed others, claimed he was following orders, insisted that he had been made a scapegoat for the failures of his superiors. But 20 years was a long time, long enough for a person to change, to develop perspective on their past actions, to potentially experience the kind of genuine remorse that Sarah had never seen during his trial. The possibility that her father might have spent 2 decades in prison genuinely regretting his choices added a layer of complexity to her feelings that she wasn't prepared to handle. "I don't know," Sarah answered honestly. "I haven't talked to him since he went to prison. I was so hurt by what he did that I couldn't bear to have any contact with him." Jake nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. "Like when Tommy Martinez at school lied about me cheating on the math test, and I didn't want to talk to him anymore." "Something like that, but much more serious," Sarah agreed, grateful for her son's ability to find parallels that helped him process difficult concepts. The sound of
Sarah's phone ringing interrupted the conversation. The caller ID showed her mother's number, and Sarah's stomach tightened as she realized that Rosa had probably seen the news report as well. Her mother had maintained a careful distance from any mention of Joseph Martinez for 2 decades, but the renewed media attention would force both of them to confront memories they had worked hard to bury. "I should probably answer this," Sarah said, showing David the phone. "It's Grandma Rosa." As Sarah stood to take the call in the kitchen, she heard Emma ask David, "Do you think we should put Grandpa Joe on the family tree, even though he did bad things?" The question followed Sarah into the kitchen as she answered the phone, her mother's familiar voice immediately filling her ear with rapid-fire Spanish that indicated a high level of stress and concern. "Mija, did you see the news? They're showing his picture everywhere. What are you going to tell the children?" Sarah leaned against the kitchen counter, looking through the doorway at her family in the living room. David was explaining something to the children in his patient way, his hands gesturing as he spoke. Emma was nodding seriously while Jake continued to look thoughtful and concerned. "They already saw it, Mama. They were asking about family trees for school, and then the news came on. I had to tell them something." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for several seconds before Rosa spoke again, her voice softer now. "Maybe it's time. They're old enough to understand that people can do bad things and still be part of a family story." The suggestion surprised Sarah. Her mother had been even more adamant about cutting ties with Joseph Martinez after his conviction, refusing to even speak his name for years. To hear her suggest that the children should know about him represented a significant shift in Rosa's thinking. "I don't know how to handle this, Mama. What if there are reporters? What if people at school find out and the kids get teased or bullied?" "Then we'll deal with it like we dealt with everything else," Rosa replied firmly, with honesty and dignity. "Your children are strong, Mija. They can handle knowing the truth about their grandfather better than they can handle more secrets and lies." After ending the call with her mother, Sarah remained in the kitchen for several minutes, processing not just the conversation, but the entire afternoon's revelations. The careful barriers she had constructed between her past and present
had been breached by a simple school assignment and a coincidental news report. There was no going back to the comfortable fiction that her children had no grandfather on her side of the family. When she returned to the living room, she found David reading to Emma from one of her picture books while Jake worked quietly on his tablet. The scene was so normal, so peacefully domestic, that it seemed impossible that their world had just been fundamentally altered by the reoccurrence of a ghost from Sarah's past. "How did Grandma Rosa take the news?" David asked quietly, closing the picture book as Emma wandered off to find her coloring supplies. "Better than I expected. She thinks the kids should know the truth." Sarah settled back onto the couch, suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of the afternoon. "I never imagined we'd be having this conversation today." Jake looked up from his tablet, clearly having been listening to their exchange despite appearing absorbed in his screen. "Are we going to visit Grandpa Joe in jail?" The question was so unexpected that Sarah couldn't immediately formulate a response. In all her years of avoiding thoughts of her father, the possibility of the children wanting to meet him had never seriously crossed her mind. She had assumed that learning about his crimes would make them want to maintain the same distance she had chosen to keep. "That's something we would need to think about very carefully," David said when it became clear that Sarah was struggling to respond. "There are a lot of things to consider before making a decision like that." Emma returned her crayons and immediately resumed work on the family tree, but Sarah noticed that she was now drawing an additional figure on the side of the paper, separate from the main family group. When Sarah asked about it, Emma explained matter-of-factly that it was Grandpa Joe. But she was putting him off to the side because he was in time out for a really long time. The child's interpretation of prison as an extended timeout might have been amusing under different circumstances, but Sarah found herself fighting back tears at the innocence of her daughter's worldview. Emma could accept the existence of a grandfather who had done bad things and was being punished for them without it fundamentally shaking her understanding of family or safety. For her, Grandpa Joe was simply another family member who happened to be unavailable due to consequences for poor choices. Jake's reaction was more complex, reflecting his greater understanding of the serious nature of his grandfather's crimes. He asked careful questions about whether the children who were hurt in the building collapse had recovered, about how long prison sentences lasted for different crimes, and about whether people could change while they were incarcerated. As evening approached and the children were occupied with their usual pre-dinner activities, Sarah and David found themselves alone in the kitchen while dinner cooked. The normalcy of preparing a meal and setting the table felt surreal after the day's revelations, but Sarah was grateful for the familiar routine. "How are you really doing with all this?" David asked as he retrieved plates from the cabinet. "I know you're focusing on the kids, but this has to be bringing up a lot of difficult memories for you." Sarah paused in her stirring of the pasta sauce, considering how to articulate the complex emotions that had been churning through her since seeing her father's face on television. "I thought I was done with him," she admitted. "I thought I had processed everything and moved on. But seeing him on the news, having to explain to the children who he is and what he did, it's like ripping off a bandage I didn't realize was still there." David moved to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist, and she continued stirring the sauce, with perhaps more vigor than was strictly necessary. "You did move on. You built a beautiful life, raised incredible children, became the kind of person he never was. Nothing that happens now changes any of that." The reassurance was exactly what Sarah needed to hear, but part of her remained unsettled by the knowledge that her father's legal troubles were far from over. The news report had mentioned additional charges and new evidence, which suggested that the story would continue to develop in the coming days and weeks. The comfortable anonymity her family had enjoyed might be about to disappear if the case attracted significant media attention. Over dinner, Emma announced that she had decided to include Grandpa Joe on her family tree after all, but with a special note explaining that he was in jail for making bad choices. Jake supported his sister's decision, suggesting that they could use it as an opportunity to talk to their classmates about how sometimes family members make mistakes. But families can still love each other while not approving of bad behavior. The mature way her children were processing this information both impressed and concerned Sarah. She was proud of their emotional intelligence and their ability to understand complex family dynamics, but she worried about putting them in a position where they might face difficult questions or judgment from other children and parents. That night, after the children were in bed, Sarah found herself standing at her bedroom window, looking out at the quiet suburban street where they had built their life. The houses were lit from within, other families going through their evening routines behind glowing windows. It struck her that any one of those families might be harboring their own secrets, their own complicated histories that they worked to keep separate.
Their present lives. David joined her at the window, following her gaze out to the peaceful neighborhood scene. "Are you worried about what happens next?" "I'm worried about everything," Sarah admitted. "What if his case becomes a big news story? What if reporters start looking into his family, trying to find us for interviews? What if the kids' friends' parents decide we're not the kind of people they want their children around?" The concerns were not unreasonable. 20 years earlier, the Riverside construction scandal had been front-page news for months. If the reopened investigation revealed new information about corruption or cover-ups, it could easily become a major story again. Sarah remembered how quickly her own life had been turned upside down when her father was first arrested, how reporters had shown up at her college dormitory looking for quotes from the construction foreman's daughter. "We'll handle whatever comes," David said simply, "the same way we've handled everything else in our marriage, together, as a family, with honesty and dignity." He was echoing her mother's words from their phone conversation, and Sarah realized that the people who loved her were all giving her the same advice. Face the situation head on rather than trying to continue hiding from it. The strategy of avoidance that had worked when she was a young adult trying to build an independent identity might not be sustainable now that she had children who deserved to understand their family history. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Sarah Martinez Delgado, Thompson. This is Marcus Chen from Channel 7 News. We're doing a follow-up story on the Riverside construction case and would like to speak with you about your father's arrest. Please call me at your earliest convenience." The message sent a chill through Sarah's body. Somehow, despite her name changes and her years of maintaining a low profile, a reporter had managed to connect her to Joseph Martinez and track down her contact information. The privacy she had worked so hard to maintain was already being compromised, less than 12 hours after the news story broke. David read the message over her shoulder, his jaw tightening as he processed the implications. "How did they find you so quickly?" "Public records, probably. Birth certificates, college enrollment records, marriage licenses. If someone really wants to trace family connections, it's not that hard in the digital age." Sarah deleted the text message, but she knew that wouldn't make the reporter go away. If Marcus Chen didn't reach her through one method, he would simply try another. As if summoned by her thoughts, her phone began ringing. The same unknown number that had sent the text. Sarah let it go to voicemail, but the sound filled their bedroom with an ominous sense of intrusion. The outside world, which had respected her privacy for 2 decades, was suddenly demanding access to her story. "We need to talk to the kids tomorrow," Sarah said, making the decision even as she spoke. Before someone at school says something, before a reporter shows up at the house, before this gets any more out of control, they need to be prepared for the possibility that people might ask them questions about their grandfather. David nodded, understanding the necessity, even as both of them wished they could maintain their children's innocence for a little longer. "We'll figure out what to say. Age-appropriate but honest, like we talked about." The voicemail notification appeared on Sarah's phone, and despite her better judgment, she played the message. Marcus Chen's professional voice filled the bedroom, polite but persistent in his request for an interview about her father's case and her family's reaction to the new charges.
I know this must be a difficult time for you and your family, but the public has a right to know how these cases affect real families. I'd like to give you the opportunity to tell your side of the story." Sarah almost laughed at the irony. After 20 years,
Working to ensure that there was no side of the story for anyone to tell, she was being offered the chance to go public with her family's experience. The reporter probably had no idea that he was speaking to someone who had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of remaining invisible. But as she looked around the bedroom she shared with David, at the family photos on the dresser and the children's artwork taped to the walls, Sarah realized that invisibility might no longer be an option. Her children were asking questions that deserved answers. Her father was facing new legal troubles that would inevitably attract media attention. And the careful boundaries between her past and present had already been irreparably breached. The question was no longer whether she would have to confront her father's legacy, but how she would choose to do it. She could continue trying to avoid the situation, hoping that the media attention would pass without finding her family, or she could take control of the narrative and decide for herself what parts of her story she was willing to share. As she turned off her phone and prepared for what she knew would be a sleepless night, Sarah found herself thinking about Emma's family tree project. The assignment had seemed so simple that morning. Draw the people who make up your family. But families, as Sarah was being reminded, were never really simple. They were complex webs of relationships, histories, choices, and consequences that could span generations. Tomorrow, she would have to help her children understand that their family tree included branches that cast long shadows, and that sometimes the most important thing about family wasn't the people who were present, but how their absence had shaped everything that came after. The morning arrived with the cruel indifference that only difficult days seem to possess. Sarah woke before her alarm, her mind immediately flooded with the events of the previous afternoon and the decisions that lay ahead. The house was still quiet, David's breathing steady beside her, but she could hear the familiar sounds of Emma's early rising echoing softly from down the hall. Her youngest had always been an early bird, often found in the living room by 6:30, arranging her stuffed animals or quietly working on art projects. Sarah slipped out of bed and padded down the hallway, finding Emma exactly where she expected, cross-legged on the living room carpet with her family tree project spread before her. But something had changed overnight. The carefully drawn stick figures from yesterday had been joined by additional family members, and Emma was working with intense concentration on what appeared to be a much more complex family structure. "Good morning, sweetheart," Sarah said softly, settling onto the floor beside her daughter. "You're up early today." Emma looked up with the bright smile that always made Sarah's heart skip a beat. "I couldn't sleep because I kept thinking about our family tree. I realized we were missing lots of people." She pointed to her expanded artwork with obvious pride. "I added Great-Grandma Carmen and Great-Grandpa Luis on Daddy's side, and I put Grandpa Joe over here with a special section." Sarah examined her daughter's work more closely and felt her breath catch. Emma had created an elaborate family structure that included relatives Sarah hadn't even realized her children knew about. More concerning was the detailed attention Emma had paid to the special section containing her grandfather. She had drawn him inside what was clearly meant to be a building with bars on the windows, but she had also added other figures around him, labeled with childish handwriting as other grandpas who made mistakes. "Emma, honey, where did you learn about Great-Grandma Carmen and all these other people?" Emma's expression became slightly defensive, as if she sensed she might be in trouble for knowing information she wasn't supposed to have. "Grandma Rosa tells me stories sometimes when you're not listening, and Daddy talks about his grandparents when we drive
Past their old house. I remember things even when grown-ups think I don't." The revelation that her daughter had been quietly cataloging family information for years caught Sarah off guard. She had assumed that her careful avoidance of certain topics had successfully limited her children's knowledge of their extended family history. But Emma's family tree revealed a level of awareness that suggested both children had been paying much closer attention to overheard conversations and casual mentions than Sarah had realized. Jake appeared at the top of the stairs, already dressed for school despite the early hour. "Mom,
There's a news truck parked across the street. Is that because of what we saw on TV yesterday? Sarah's stomach dropped as she moved to the front window, careful to stay behind the curtain as she peered out at the quiet residential street. A white van with the Channel 7 News logo was indeed parked directly across from their house, its satellite equipment visible on the roof. A woman in a professional suit stood beside it, speaking into a cell phone while occasionally glancing toward their front door. "David!" Sarah called urgently toward the bedroom, her voice carrying the kind of tension that always brought him running. "We have a problem." Within minutes, David had joined her at the window while the children continued their morning routines with the adaptability that kids possessed when faced with adult stress they didn't fully understand. Emma returned to her family tree project, while Jake began preparing his backpack for school, both of them stealing occasional glances at their parents' tense conversation by the window. "How did they find us so fast?" David asked, echoing Sarah's own disbelief at the speed with which her carefully maintained privacy had been compromised. Public records, social media, school enrollment information. If you know where to look and you have the resources, tracing family connections isn't that difficult anymore. Sarah watched as the reporter finished her phone call and began walking toward their house. "She's coming to the door." The doorbell rang with the kind of authoritative chime that suggested the person on the other side wasn't going to give up easily. Sarah felt trapped between her desire to protect her family's privacy and the growing realization that avoiding the situation might no longer be possible. The reporter had already found them, which meant other media outlets would likely follow soon. "Kids, go upstairs and finish getting ready for school," David instructed firmly. "Don't come downstairs until we tell you it's okay." Emma looked up from her artwork with the kind of perceptive expression that always reminded Sarah how much her daughter understood about situations that adults tried to shield her from. "Is the lady outside here because of Grandpa Joe?" The directness of the question forced Sarah to confront the reality that her children were already connecting the dots between yesterday's news report and this morning's uninvited visitor. Lying or deflecting would only create more confusion and potentially make them more vulnerable to manipulation if reporters approached them directly. "Yes, sweetheart. Some people want to ask questions about our family because of what's happening with your grandfather, but Daddy and I are going to handle it, so you don't need to worry." Jake paused at the bottom of the stairs, his expression serious beyond his 9 years. "Should we not talk to strangers who ask about our family?" "That's exactly right," David confirmed. "If anyone you don't know tries to ask you questions about our family, you come find Mom or me immediately. Don't talk to them, don't answer any questions, just walk away and find a trusted adult." The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time, followed by a polite but persistent knocking. Sarah looked through the peephole and saw the woman she recognized from Channel 7's morning news program, Rebecca Martinez. Ironically sharing the same last name that Sarah had worked so hard to distance herself from. "Mrs. Thompson?" the reporter called through the door, her voice professionally
Friendly but determined. "I'm Rebecca Martinez from Channel 7 News. I was hoping to speak with you about your father's case and how your family is handling the recent developments." Sarah stepped back from the door, her heart racing at hearing her married name spoken aloud by a stranger who had somehow connected her to Joseph Martinez despite all her efforts to maintain separation. The reporter's use of Mrs. Thompson, rather than any of her previous names, suggested a thorough background investigation that had traced her through multiple identity changes. David moved to stand beside her, his presence steady and protective. "We don't have to talk to her. We can just wait until she leaves." But even as he spoke, both of them knew that simply ignoring the situation wouldn't make it disappear. The reporter had invested time and resources in finding them, which meant she wasn't likely to give up after one unsuccessful attempt. Other media outlets would follow, and eventually the attention would become impossible to avoid. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand this must be a difficult time for your family," Rebecca Martinez continued through the door, "but I'd really like to give you the opportunity to share your perspective. The public is interested in how families cope when a loved one faces serious charges, and your story could help other families in similar situations." The appeal to public service and helping other families struck Sarah as both manipulative and potentially genuine. She had spent 20 years wondering if other families had gone through experiences similar to hers, if there were resources or support systems she had missed during the most difficult period of her life. But the idea of becoming a public example of family trauma felt overwhelming and potentially dangerous for her children. "I'm not going away," the reporter added after a moment of silence. "This story is going to be told whether you participate or not. Wouldn't you rather have some control over how your family is represented?" The implicit threat in the statement made Sarah's decision for her. If Rebecca Martinez was determined to include her family in the story regardless of their cooperation, it would be better to participate on her own terms, rather than allow herself to be portrayed solely through public records and unnamed sources. Sarah opened the door but kept the chain lock engaged, creating a small gap that allowed conversation while maintaining a physical barrier. "I'm not interested in doing an interview, but I want to know what you're planning to report about my family." Rebecca Martinez was smaller in person than she appeared on television, but her presence was commanding in the way that successful television journalists often possessed. She smiled professionally while clearly assessing Sarah through the partially open door. "I'm working on a follow-up piece about the Riverside construction case and how the families of the accused men have rebuilt their lives over the past 20 years. Your father is one of 6 men facing new charges, and several of the other families have agreed to speak about their experiences." The information that other families were participating in the story changed Sarah's calculations significantly. If she remained silent while other families shared their perspectives, her absence from the narrative might be more conspicuous than her participation. Her children could potentially face questions at school about why their family had refused to comment, while others had been willing to speak publicly. "What kind of questions would you want to ask?" Sarah asked, still maintaining the physical barrier of the partially open door. "How did your father's conviction affect your family 20 years ago? How did you explain the situation to your children? What's your reaction to the new charges being filed? Do you maintain any contact with your father?" Rebecca Martinez spoke with the practiced efficiency of someone who had conducted hundreds of similar interviews. Each question felt like a probe into wounds that Sarah had worked years to heal. The idea of discussing her father's impact on her life with a television reporter,
like voluntarily reopening every carefully sealed emotional scar. But the alternative of having her story told without her input might be even worse for her children's long-term well-being. "I need to think about it and discuss it with my husband," Sarah said finally. "If I decide to do an interview, it would have to be on my terms, with questions I approve in advance, and with a guarantee that my children's privacy will be protected." Rebecca Martinez nodded as if she had expected these conditions. "Of course. My photographer and I could come back this afternoon if that works better for you. We're hoping to air the story tomorrow evening, so we'd need to schedule something today if you decide to participate." The timeline felt rushed and manipulative, designed to pressure Sarah into making a decision before she had time to fully consider the implications. But the reporter's mention of airing the story the following evening also meant that Sarah's window for controlling her family's participation was rapidly closing. After Rebecca Martinez left, promising to return that afternoon for Sarah's final decision, the house felt somehow smaller and more vulnerable. The children had watched the interaction from the upstairs landing, and their questions came in a steady stream as soon as the front door was closed. "Are you going to be on TV?" Emma asked with the kind of excitement that only 7-year-olds could muster when faced with the possibility of celebrity in their family. "Are we going to be famous because of Grandpa Joe?" Jake's question carried more concern than excitement, suggesting he understood better than his sister that media attention wasn't always positive. Sarah and David spent the next hour explaining the situation to their children in terms they could understand. A reporter wanted to talk to families who had relatives facing legal trouble, and she was trying to decide whether participating would be helpful or harmful for their family. The children listened with the serious attention they usually reserved for discussions about major family decisions, like moving or changing schools. "I think you should talk to the reporter,"
Emma announced after considering the situation with her characteristic directness. If people are going to find out about Grandpa Joe anyway, maybe you should tell them the true story instead of letting them guess. Jake nodded in agreement, his expression thoughtful. Like when Tommy spread that story about me cheating on the math test. It got worse when I didn't say anything, but when I told Mrs. Peterson what really happened, everyone understood better. The children's perspective on the situation surprised Sarah with its clarity and maturity. They had grasped something that she had been struggling with, that silence in the face of public speculation could be more damaging than controlled disclosure of the truth. David made coffee while Sarah called her mother to discuss the reporter's visit and the decision they were facing. Rosa's reaction was swift and definitive. "Talk to her," Rosa said without hesitation. "Your children are going to face questions whether you participate or not. Better that people hear the truth from you than have them make up their own stories about what kind of family you are." The conversation with her mother lasted nearly an hour, covering practical considerations like what topics Sarah should be willing to discuss and what boundaries she should maintain. Rosa's perspective was informed by her own experience of dealing with media attention during Joseph Martinez's original trial, and her advice reflected hard-won wisdom about managing public scrutiny. "Remember, mija, you are not responsible for what your father did. You are only responsible for how you choose to respond to it now." After ending the call with her mother, Sarah found herself standing in the kitchen, staring out at the backyard where her children played on the swing set David had built 3 years earlier. The normalcy of their laughter and play stood in stark contrast to the complex adult decisions being made just a few feet away inside the house. David joined her at the window, following her gaze to their children's carefree afternoon play. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about what kind of example I want to set for them," Sarah replied slowly. "Do I want them to see me hiding from difficult situations, or do I want them to see me facing challenges head-on, even when it's scary?" The question answered itself even as she spoke it aloud. Throughout their marriage, Sarah and David had tried to model honesty, courage, and integrity for their children. Avoiding the reporter's questions would send a message that some truths were too dangerous to speak, that family loyalty required maintaining harmful secrets, and that shame was an acceptable reason for silence. When Rebecca Martinez returned that afternoon, as promised, Sarah was ready with her decision. She would do the interview, but with strict conditions about the scope of questions, the editing process, and the protection of her children's identities. The interview would take place in their living room rather than at the television station, giving Sarah some control over the environment and allowing her to end the conversation if it became too invasive. The process of preparing for the interview felt surreal. Sarah changed clothes 3 times, trying to find something that looked professional but not overly formal, authentic but not too casual. David helped her practice potential responses to difficult questions while the children were occupied with homework at the kitchen table. "What if she asks whether you think your father is guilty?" David prompted during their practice session. "I'll say that I'm not qualified to judge his legal guilt or innocence, but that his choices had consequences that affected many people, including his own family. What if she asks whether you'd want your children to have a relationship with him?" This question was harder, touching on uncertainties that Sarah hadn't fully resolved in her own mind. "I'll say that any decisions about family relationships would be made based on what's best for my children's emotional well-being, and that those are private family matters." When Rebecca Martinez arrived with her camera operator, Sarah was struck by how the simple act of setting up television equipment transformed her familiar living room into something that felt foreign and exposed. The bright lights needed for filming made everything look harsh and artificial, while the camera's presence seemed to suck the comfort and privacy out of the space her family called home. The interview itself lasted nearly 2 hours, though Sarah knew that only a few minutes would actually appear in the final news story. Rebecca Martinez proved to be a skilled interviewer, beginning with easy questions about Sarah's current life and family, before gradually moving toward more difficult topics about her father's case and its impact on their lives. "When did you first learn about your father's involvement in the Riverside construction scandal?" Rebecca asked, her voice professionally sympathetic. I was in college, 20 years old, and I found out the same way everyone else did when I saw his arrest on the evening news, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the memory. Up until that moment, I had no idea that anything wrong was happening at his company. How did that revelation change your relationship with your father? Sarah paused, considering how much personal detail she was willing to share with the viewing public. It shattered my understanding of who he was. The man I had grown up loving and respecting turned out to be capable of choices that put children's lives at risk for financial gain. I couldn't reconcile those two versions of the same person. Have you maintained any contact with him during his incarceration? No. I made the decision to cut off contact because I needed to protect my own emotional well-being and build a life separate from his choices. Rebecca Martinez nodded as if this response was exactly what she had expected. And now that you have children of your own, how do you explain their grandfather's situation to them? We believe in being honest with our
children in age-appropriate ways. They know that their grandfather made serious mistakes that hurt people, and that there are consequences for those kinds of choices. But we also try to help them understand that people are complex, and that loving someone doesn't mean approving of everything they do. The hardest part of the interview came when Rebecca Martinez asked about Sarah's reaction to the new charges being filed against her father. The question forced her to confront feelings she had been avoiding since seeing the news report the previous day. I'm disappointed that it appears he may have been involved in additional wrongdoing beyond what was already known, Sarah said carefully. But I'm not surprised. Someone who was willing to compromise children's safety for money once might be willing to do it again. Do you think he deserves a second chance? The question struck at the heart of Sarah's conflicted feelings about forgiveness, family loyalty, and personal protection. I think everyone deserves the opportunity to change and make amends for their mistakes, but earning a second chance requires acknowledging what you did wrong and demonstrating that you've genuinely changed. I haven't seen evidence of that kind of accountability from my father. When the interview finally concluded and the television crew began packing their equipment, Sarah felt simultaneously drained and relieved. She had managed to maintain her composure throughout the questioning, avoided revealing more personal information than she was comfortable sharing, and presented her family's situation with dignity rather than defensiveness. The children, who had been confined to the kitchen during the filming, immediately wanted to know what the reporter had asked and how Sarah had answered. Their questions revealed that they had been listening to fragments of the conversation despite the closed doors, and Emma wanted to know if she would be able to see her mother on television the following evening. Will people at school know that you're Grandpa Joe's daughter now? Jake asked, with the practical concern that always impressed Sarah with its maturity. Some people might figure it out, Sarah admitted, but remember what we talked about. You don't have to answer questions about our family if you don't want to. You can always tell people that it's private family business and they should talk to me or Dad if they have questions. That evening, as the family went through their normal dinner and bedtime routines, Sarah found herself hyper-aware of how precious their ordinary moments were. The simple act of helping Emma with her homework and listening to Jake read from his library book felt like treasures she had taken for granted before the day's events reminded her how quickly privacy and normalcy could be disrupted. David found her standing in Emma's doorway after both children were asleep, watching their daughter's peaceful breathing in the soft glow of her nightlight. How are you feeling about the interview now that it's over? Scared, Sarah admitted honestly, but also relieved that it's done and I don't have to keep wondering what I would say if someone asked me these questions. Do you think you'll regret it? Sarah considered the question seriously before answering. I might regret some specific things I said, or wish I had expressed something differently, but I don't think I'll regret the decision to speak up rather than staying silent. Our children deserve to see us handling difficult situations with courage and honesty. The phone rang as they were getting ready for bed, an unknown local number that Sarah recognized as likely being another reporter. She let it go to voicemail, but the message confirmed her suspicion. A journalist from the city's newspaper wanted to follow up on the television story with a more detailed print interview. It's starting, Sarah said to David as they deleted the voicemail. Once one story runs, everyone else will want their own angle on it.
David wrapped his arms around her as they stood in their bedroom, the quiet house around them feeling suddenly fragile.
Exposed. We'll handle whatever comes next. One interview at a time, one decision at a time. But as Sarah lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of her sleeping family, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. By agreeing to speak publicly about her father's case, she had opened a door that couldn't be closed again. The careful anonymity she had maintained for 20 years was about to end, and tomorrow evening her face would appear on television screens throughout the city, identifying her publicly as the daughter of Joseph Martinez. The protective barriers between her past and present were crumbling, and she had no way of knowing what consequences that exposure would bring for her children. Outside her bedroom window, the street was quiet, except for the occasional car passing through their peaceful neighborhood. But Sarah knew that by tomorrow night, that peace might be permanently disrupted by the attention her interview would bring. She had made her choice based on the belief that controlled honesty was better than enforced silence, but only time would tell whether that calculation had been correct. The last thing Sarah saw before finally falling asleep was Emma's family tree project, still spread on the dresser where she had left it after showing it to David. Her daughter's innocent drawing had somehow predicted the day's events, capturing in childish crayon strokes the complex reality that families included both the people you celebrated and the people whose choices cast long shadows over everything that came after. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Sarah's interview aired and the community learned about her connection to one of the city's most notorious construction scandals. But tonight, her children slept safely in their beds, and her family remained intact despite the storms gathering around them. Whatever came next, they would face it together, armed with truth instead of secrets, and courage instead of shame. The morning of the broadcast arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep through the windows despite the bright sunshine. Sarah woke with a knot in her stomach that had been growing tighter since she'd agreed to the interview 3 days earlier. Today, by evening, her face would be on television screens across the city, and her carefully maintained privacy would be permanently shattered. Emma bounced into the bedroom at 7:30, already dressed for school and carrying her completed family tree project with obvious pride. "Mommy, I finished adding all the people we talked about, and I wrote a story to go with it about how families can love each other even when some people make bad choices." Sarah examined her daughter's work, marveling at the sophistication of thought represented in the simple crayon drawings. Emma had not only included Joseph Martinez in his timeout building, but had also added what appeared to be other family members Sarah didn't recognize, all connected by careful lines that showed relationships without judgment. "Who are these other people, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, pointing to figures she didn't recognize. "Those are the children who got hurt when the building fell down," Emma explained factually. "Ms. Rodriguez said our family trees should show how our families connect to other people in the community, so I put them in because Grandpa Joe's choices affected their families too." The inclusion of the victims in Emma's family tree struck Sarah with unexpected force. Her 7-year-old daughter had grasped something that Sarah herself had struggled with for 20 years, that her father's crimes had created connections between their family and complete strangers, binding them together through shared trauma and consequences.
If it's true that our grandpa is a criminal, Sarah's heart sank as she realized the news of her interview had already begun circulating among the school community. She had hoped they would have more time to prepare the children for questions from their peers, but social media and local news websites had apparently accelerated the timeline. "What did you tell Tyler?" Sarah asked, sitting on the edge of the bed and pulling Jake closer. "I said it was true that our grandpa made some bad choices a long time ago, but that our family is different now, and we don't talk about him because he's in prison." Jake's response showed remarkable maturity for a 9-year-old, but Sarah could see the stress in his eyes. "Tyler said his brother thinks it's cool that we have a relative who's famous for being a criminal." The casual way other children were processing this information both relieved and concerned Sarah. Kids often had a different perspective on adult problems, sometimes seeing excitement where adults saw shame, but she worried about how the novelty would wear off and whether her children would face more serious social consequences as the story developed. David emerged from the shower to find his family gathered on the bed, Emma's family tree spread between them like a map of their complicated history. "How's everyone feeling about today?" he asked, his voice deliberately casual despite the underlying tension they were all experiencing. "I'm nervous about people asking questions at school," Jake admitted, "but I'm also kind of glad that we don't have to keep it secret anymore. It was weird knowing something important about our family that we couldn't talk about." Emma nodded vigorously in agreement. "It's like when I broke Mom's favorite mug but tried to hide it in the trash. I felt much better after I told the truth and said I was sorry."
The comparison between her father's crimes and Emma's childhood mishap might have been amusing under different circumstances, but Sarah found herself struck by her daughter's instinctive understanding that secrets created more problems than truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable. The drive to school that morning felt charged with anticipation and anxiety. Sarah found herself scanning the familiar streets and buildings of their neighborhood, wondering how different everything would look after tonight's broadcast. Would the grocery store clerks recognize her? Would other parents at school events treat her differently? Would her children face whispers and pointing fingers in hallways and playgrounds? At Emma's school, Sarah walked her daughter to the classroom door as she did every morning, but today she found herself hyper-aware of other parents' glances and conversations. Were they already talking about the Martinez family and their connection to the Riverside construction scandal? Or was she simply projecting her own anxiety onto normal morning interactions? Mrs. Thompson, Emma's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, approached with the kind of gentle concern that suggested she had already heard about the evening's broadcast. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Sarah's stomach tightened as she followed Mrs. Patterson away from the classroom door and the curious ears of other parents dropping off their children. She had been dreading this conversation, knowing that the school would need to be prepared for potential disruptions or questions arising from her public connection to her father's case. "I heard about your television interview tonight," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "I wanted you to know that we'll be keeping an eye on Emma and making sure she doesn't face any inappropriate questions or comments from other children. If any issues arise, please don't hesitate to contact me immediately." The offer of support was both reassuring and terrifying, confirming that the school community was already aware of the coming broadcast and preparing for its potential impact. Sarah thanked Mrs. Patterson and promised to stay in close communication about any problems that might develop. Jake's school presented similar challenges, with his teacher, Mr. Harrison,
requesting a brief conversation about how to handle any questions or disruptions that might arise from media attention surrounding the family. The fact that both schools were already preparing for consequences drove home the reality that Sarah's decision to speak publicly would affect far more than just her immediate family. On the drive home from school drop-offs, Sarah's phone began ringing with increasing frequency. Reporters from newspapers, radio stations, and competing television stations had apparently gotten wind of her interview and wanted their own exclusive angles on the story. She declined all requests, but the volume of calls suggested that her story was generating more interest than she had anticipated. David took the day off work, a decision they had made earlier in the week when they realized that the broadcast day would require their full attention and emotional energy. They spent the morning fielding phone calls, preparing responses to questions the children might face, and trying to maintain some semblance of normal routine despite the underlying current of anxiety that ran through every conversation. Rosa arrived at noon, carrying grocery bags and wearing the determined expression she always adopted when her family faced challenges that required her direct intervention. "I came to make sure you eat something before tonight," she announced, bustling into the kitchen with the efficient energy that had gotten their family through countless crises over the years. "Mama, you didn't need to drive all the way over here," Sarah protested, though she was secretly grateful for her mother's presence and the familiar comfort of being cared for during a stressful time. "Nonsense. This is what family does when someone is facing something difficult. We show up, we make food, and we stand together." Rosa began unpacking groceries with the methodical precision that had always characterized her approach to crisis management. "Besides, I want to be here when it airs tonight. We should watch it together as a family." The idea of watching her own interview with her children and mother felt surreal and slightly nauseating, but Sarah recognized the wisdom in Rosa's suggestion. If they were going to face the consequences of public exposure together, they should also experience the initial broadcast as a unified family unit. Around 2 o'clock, Sarah noticed a familiar white van parked across the street from their house. Channel 7's mobile news unit had returned, presumably to capture footage of the neighborhood and house where Joseph Martinez's daughter had built her life. The presence of the news crew made her feel like a specimen under a microscope, observed and analyzed for public consumption. "They're back," David observed, joining her at the front window. "Should we be concerned about them filming our house?" Sarah wasn't sure about the legal boundaries regarding media presence on public streets, but the feeling of being watched and documented felt invasive and unsettling. She called the non-emergency police line to inquire about regulations regarding news crews in residential neighborhoods, learning that as long as they remained on public property, their presence was legally permitted. The afternoon stretched endlessly, each hour feeling like a countdown to an execution rather than the broadcast of a news story.
Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on normal activities, her mind cycling through worst-case scenarios about how the community would react to learning about her connection to Joseph Martinez. Emma and Jake arrived home from school with reports that varied dramatically in tone and content. Emma had apparently become something of a celebrity among her second-grade classmates, who were impressed by her connection to someone who had been on television and in newspapers. Her teacher had successfully managed to redirect the children's curiosity into a productive discussion about family diversity and how people could love family members while not approving of their choices. Jake's experience had been more complicated, involving several direct questions from older students who
Heard about the interview through social media and local news websites. He had handled the inquiries with the responses Sarah and David had helped him practice, but the attention had clearly been stressful and emotionally draining. Some kids were nice about it, but others asked really mean questions, Jake reported as Sarah helped him with his afternoon snack. Billy Patterson asked if I was going to become a criminal too because it runs in families. I told him that people make their own choices and that my family teaches me to make good choices. Sarah felt a surge of pride at her son's mature response, but also anger at the cruelty that children could display when presented with information they didn't fully understand. She made mental notes to follow up with Jake's teacher about monitoring peer interactions more closely and potentially addressing the issue with the entire class if problems continued. As evening approached, the Martinez-Thompson household began to feel like a fortress under siege. More news vans had appeared on the street, and Sarah could see reporters and camera operators setting up equipment for what appeared to be live broadcasts from outside their home. The attention felt disproportionate to what she had expected from a local news story about families affected by white-collar crime. "Why are there so many people outside our house?" Emma asked, her excitement about being on television beginning to give way to confusion and concern about the circus-like atmosphere developing in their normally quiet neighborhood. Sarah struggled to explain that her father's case was apparently more significant than she had realized, and that her decision to speak publicly as his daughter had generated more interest than anticipated. The presence of multiple news outlets suggested that the story was being treated as a major development rather than a routine follow-up piece. David fielded phone calls from concerned neighbors who were wondering about the media presence and its impact on the neighborhood. The Johnsons from next door offered to let them park in their driveway if they needed to avoid reporters, while the elderly couple across the street expressed worry about the disruption to their usually peaceful street. At 6 o'clock, the family gathered in the living room for the evening news broadcast. Rosa had prepared sandwiches that nobody felt like eating, while Emma and Jake sat unusually close to their parents on the couch. The familiar Channel 7 evening news theme music had never sounded so ominous or personally threatening. Sarah's interview appeared as the lead story, introduced with dramatic graphics and Rebecca Martinez's serious voiceover about families struggling with the legacy of white-collar crime. The segment began with archival footage from the original Riverside construction trial 20 years earlier, including shots of Joseph Martinez being led away in handcuffs that Sarah had worked for decades to forget. Seeing her father's face on television again, even in old footage, hit Sarah with unexpected emotional force. He looked younger in the archival material, his hair darker and his face less weathered by prison life and time, but his expression carried the same defiant anger she remembered from their last conversation before she cut off contact. The transition to current footage of Sarah in her living room felt jarring and surreal. She barely recognized herself on screen, noting how nervous she looked despite her efforts to appear composed and confident. Her voice sounded higher than normal, and she could see tension in her posture that hadn't been apparent during the actual interview. "When I first learned about my father's involvement in the Riverside construction scandal, it shattered my understanding of who he was," her televised self was saying. "The man I had grown up loving and respecting turned out to be capable of choices that put children's lives at risk for financial gain." Emma clapped her hands together with delight at seeing her mother on television, while Jake watched with the intense concentration he usually reserved for particularly challenging games. Rosa sat quietly beside Sarah on the couch,
her hand finding her daughter's arm in a gesture of silent support. The news story interwove Sarah's interview with commentary from legal experts, interviews with other family members of the accused men, and updated information about the new charges being filed. The overall piece painted a picture of families struggling to rebuild their lives while grappling with the ongoing consequences of their relatives' crimes. What struck Sarah most forcefully was how different her words sounded when edited and presented within the context of a television news story. Statements that had felt measured and thoughtful during the interview now seemed stark and final when presented alongside dramatic graphics and ominous background music. "Have you maintained any contact with him during his incarceration?" Rebecca Martinez's voice asked from the television speakers. "No. I made the decision to cut off contact because I needed to protect my own emotional well-being and build a life separate from his choices." The finality of those words, broadcast to thousands of viewers throughout the city, felt like a public declaration that couldn't be taken back. Sarah had essentially announced to the entire community that she had rejected her father and chosen to live without him in her life. The story concluded with footage of their house taken earlier that day, Rebecca Martinez's voice explaining that Sarah Martinez Thompson had rebuilt her life as a devoted mother and community member, but that the new charges against her father had forced her family to confront painful memories they had worked to leave behind. As the news program moved on to other stories, the living room fell into stunned silence. Emma was the first to speak, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and confusion. "You looked really pretty on TV, Mommy, but you seemed sad when you talked about Grandpa Joe." Jake's observation was more complex and troubling. "Now everyone in the whole city knows about our family. What happens if some of those people don't like us because of what Grandpa Joe did?" The question struck at the heart of Sarah's deepest fears about the decision to speak publicly. By identifying herself as Joseph Martinez's daughter, she had potentially exposed her entire family to judgment, blame, and social consequences that could affect everything from their children's friendships to David's professional relationships. Before anyone could respond to Jake's concern, the doorbell rang with the insistent chiming that had become familiar over the past several days. David looked through the peephole and reported that it was a different reporter, someone from a competing television station who apparently wanted to capitalize on the story's momentum with their own exclusive interview. "We're not talking to anyone else," Sarah said firmly, her voice carrying a determination that surprised even her. "I said what I needed to say, and now we're going to focus on our family and dealing with whatever comes next." But whatever comes next began immediately as Sarah's phone started ringing with people she hadn't heard from in years. High school friends who had seen the news story and wanted to offer support or satisfy their curiosity. Former colleagues who remembered her maiden name and had made the connection to Joseph Martinez. Extended family members who had maintained distance during the original scandal but now felt compelled to reach out. Each conversation required Sarah to relive aspects of the story she had just shared publicly, explaining her decisions and defending her choices to people whose opinions had never mattered to her daily life but somehow felt significant in the aftermath of her public disclosure. The most difficult call came from her college roommate, Jennifer, who had witnessed Sarah's emotional breakdown during her father's original trial and had helped her through the initial decision to cut contact with him. "I saw you on the news tonight," Jennifer said without preamble when Sarah answered the phone. "How are you really
doing with all this?" The question cut through all the public relations aspects of the evening and addressed Sarah's actual emotional state for the first time since the broadcast had ended. "I'm terrified," Sarah admitted, stepping into the kitchen for privacy while her family continued processing the evening's events in the living room. "Terrified of what?" "That I've made a huge mistake. That exposing my family like this will hurt my children more than it helps them. That people will judge us and treat us differently because of something that happened before my kids were even born." Jennifer listened quietly as Sarah poured out her fears and doubts, providing the kind of supportive listening that only old friends could offer.
"You did the right thing," she said finally. "I remember how much pain those secrets caused you in college. Your kids are better off knowing the truth and seeing you handle it with courage than they would be living with lies and shame." After ending the call with Jennifer, Sarah returned to the living room to find her family engaged in an animated discussion about the news story and its potential consequences. Emma was advocating for inviting her classmates over to meet the family that was on TV, while Jake was expressing concern about whether their presence in the story would affect David's job or their ability to participate in normal community activities. Rosa, ever practical, was focused on concrete preparations for the challenges they might face in the coming days and weeks. You need to decide how you're going to handle the phone calls and interview requests, because this isn't going to stop tomorrow. People are going to want to keep talking about this story. David nodded in agreement with Rosa's assessment. We should probably establish some clear boundaries about what we're willing to discuss and what we consider private family business. The kids need to know what they should and shouldn't say if people approach them. The family spent the next hour developing a plan for managing the increased attention their story was likely to generate. They established simple responses for various types of questions, discussed how to handle requests for interviews or photographs, and created strategies for protecting their children's privacy while acknowledging the public interest in their situation. As bedtime approached, both Emma and Jake seemed to be processing the evening's events with a resilience that surprised their parents. Emma had incorporated her television appearance into her bedtime story, spinning an elaborate tale about a princess whose family had to be brave when facing difficult dragons. Jake asked thoughtful questions about whether other families had experienced similar situations and how they had handled the challenges. "Are you glad you talked to the reporter?" Jake asked as Sarah tucked him into bed. The question forced Sarah to evaluate her decision based on the actual experience rather than her fears and anxieties about potential consequences. "I think so," she said honestly. "I'm scared about what happens next, but I'm also relieved that we don't have to keep secrets anymore. And I'm proud that our family is facing this together instead of hiding from it." Jake nodded solemnly, apparently satisfied with this response. "I think Grandpa Joe should know that we're not ashamed of our family, even though we don't approve of what he did." The unexpected suggestion caught Sarah off guard, forcing her to consider aspects of the situation she hadn't fully examined. Her public statement about cutting off contact with her father had been broadcast throughout the city, potentially reaching him if he had access to television in prison. For the first time, she wondered what his reaction might be to learning that his daughter had spoken publicly about their estranged relationship. After the children were finally asleep, Sarah and David sat together on their back porch, looking out at the quiet suburban yard that represented everything they had built together over their 12 years of marriage. The familiar space felt like a refuge from the circus of media attention,
Public scrutiny that had invaded their front yard. "Do you think we handled everything okay today?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the exhaustion of emotional intensity and public exposure. David considered the question carefully before responding. "I think we did the best we could with a situation none of us had any experience handling. The kids seemed to be coping well. Your mother provided exactly the support we needed, and you presented yourself and our family with dignity. But I'm worried about the long-term consequences. The story isn't going to disappear tomorrow, and we don't know how it's going to affect the kids' social relationships, your professional opportunities, or our standing in the community." The concerns David voiced echoed Sarah's own fears about the decision to speak publicly. By choosing transparency over privacy, they had gained some control over their family's narrative, but they had also exposed themselves to judgment and consequences they couldn't predict or control. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Saw you on the news tonight. Your father is proud that you're standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. He wanted you to know that he thinks about you and the grandchildren he's never met every day." The message was signed Father Miguel, St. Catherine's prison ministry, and it hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her public statement about maintaining no contact with her father apparently prompted his prison chaplain to reach out on his behalf, creating a communication bridge she had never anticipated or desired. David read the message over her shoulder, his arm tightening around her waist as they both processed this unexpected development. "You don't have to respond," he said quietly. "You've made your boundaries clear, and you don't owe anyone an explanation for maintaining them." But the message had accomplished what 20 years of silence couldn't. It had forced Sarah to confront the reality that her father was a human being who experienced loss and regret, not just a symbol of family shame and betrayal. The knowledge that he thought about her and her children daily added a layer of complexity to her feelings that she wasn't prepared to handle. Inside the house, Emma's family tree project lay on the kitchen counter where she had left it after showing it to everyone throughout the evening. The simple crayon drawing had somehow predicted and prepared them for the day's events, capturing in childish artistry the truth that families contain multitudes of relationships, stories, and consequences that couldn't be erased or simplified. As Sarah and David prepared for bed, they could hear voices and see lights from the news crews who were apparently planning to maintain their vigil outside the house overnight. The invasion of their privacy felt like a violation, but it also represented the price of choosing public honesty over private secrets. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we'll face it together," David said, as they turned off the bedroom lights. "And our children will see that their parents handle difficult situations with courage and integrity, even when it's scary." Sarah nodded, but sleep came fitfully as she processed the day's events and worried about the challenges that awaited them in the morning. She had made her choice to speak publicly about her father's crimes and their family's response, but the consequences of that decision were only beginning to unfold. The last thing she remembered before finally falling asleep was Emma's innocent question about whether they should put Grandpa Joe on the family tree, despite his bad choices. The answer, Sarah realized, was not about whether Joseph Martinez deserved inclusion in their family story, but about whether they were strong enough to acknowledge that even the most painful family relationships shaped who they became. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the same kitchen where she had first seen her father's arrest on the evening news, but everything had changed. The media attention had eventually subsided, replaced by other stories and scandals that captured public interest. Her children had adapted to their new reality with remarkable resilience, occasionally facing questions about their grandfather, but generally finding that their classmates moved on to other topics with the short attention spans of youth. The most significant change had been Sarah's decision, made after weeks of internal struggle and family discussions, to accept one visit with her father at the prison. The meeting had been emotional and complicated, filled with 20 years of accumulated hurt and tentative attempts at communication across an enormous gulf of pain and time. Joseph Martinez had aged dramatically during his incarceration, his hair completely gray and his face marked by years of regret and isolation. But he had also demonstrated something Sarah hadn't expected: genuine remorse for his choices and their impact on his family and the victims of his crimes. Emma's Family Tree Project had won first place in her school's Family Heritage Fair, celebrated for its honest portrayal of family complexity and the thoughtful essay she had written about loving people while not approving of their actions. The project now hung framed in their hallway, a reminder that families could acknowledge their difficult histories without being defined by them. Jake had become something of a spokesperson among his peers for children dealing with family problems, offering mature insights about how families could support each other through challenging situations. His teacher had recommended him for the school's peer counseling program, recognizing his unusual emotional intelligence and wisdom. Sarah had received dozens of letters from other families dealing with similar situations, thanking her for speaking publicly and sharing their own stories of shame, secrecy, and eventual healing. The response had convinced her that her decision to break the silence had been correct, Even though it had come with costs and challenges, she was still processing. The most unexpected consequence had been a job offer from a nonprofit organization that worked with families affected by white-collar crime. They had seen her television interview and recognized her potential to help other families navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges that arose when a family member was convicted of serious crimes. As Sarah prepared breakfast for her family on this ordinary Tuesday morning, she reflected on how different their lives looked from the outside versus how they actually felt from the inside. To observers, they might appear to be the family that had been touched by scandal and media attention. But from Sarah's perspective, they were simply a family that had chosen truth over secrets, courage over shame, and love over fear. Emma bounded down the stairs carrying a new art project, this one depicting their family tree in full bloom, with flowers representing the good choices family members had made and storm clouds representing the difficult periods they had weathered together. "Look, Mommy, I made us into a garden where all different kinds of weather can happen, but the tree keeps growing anyway." A metaphor struck Sarah as perfect for their family's journey. They had experienced storms and sunshine, damage and growth, loss and recovery. But through it all, their roots had remained strong and their capacity for love had expanded rather than contracted. David emerged from his
She showered to find his family gathered around the breakfast table, engaged in their usual combination of homework review, schedule coordination, and casual conversation about their plans for the day. The scene was perfectly ordinary and beautifully normal, representing everything they had worked to preserve and protect throughout their journey from secrecy to transparency. As they prepared to leave for school and work, Sarah caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. She looked like the same person who had been shocked by her father's arrest on the evening news months earlier, but she felt fundamentally different. The weight of maintaining secrets had been replaced by the confidence that came from living honestly, even when honesty was difficult and complicated. The mailbox contained the usual assortment of bills, advertisements, and school communications, but also a letter from the prison chaplain who had reached out months earlier. Inside was a brief note explaining that Joseph Martinez had enrolled in a victims impact program and was working with a therapist to understand the full consequences of his actions. He wanted his daughter to know that he supported her decision to speak publicly and was proud of the family she had built despite his failures. The letter didn't erase 20 years of pain and estrangement, but it represented something Sarah had never expected, evidence that her father was capable of change and growth, even under circumstances as limiting as long-term incarceration. The knowledge didn't obligate her to forgive him or restore their relationship, but it did provide a sense of closure to the chapter of her life that had begun with his arrest and continued through her decision to speak publicly about their family's experience. As Emma and Jake climbed into the car for the drive to school, they chattered about their plans for the day with the enthusiasm and optimism that characterized children who felt secure in their family's love and support. They had absorbed the lesson that families could contain complexity without losing their capacity for joy, and that truth was ultimately more protective than secrets, even when truth was painful or embarrassing. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had before their brush with media attention, but Sarah experienced it differently now. She no longer worried about protecting a carefully constructed facade or maintaining distance from uncomfortable family history. The freedom that came from living openly, even when openness invited scrutiny and judgment, had been worth every challenge they had faced along the way.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.